Module 8, the Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply Model. Aggregate Demand, Aggregate Supply Model, a model that shows what determines real GDP and the aggregate price level through the interaction between total spending on domestic goods and services, i.e. aggregate demand, and total production by businesses, i.e. aggregate supply. Let's go through some vocabulary. Aggregate demand, AD, the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services in an economy. Aggregate supply, AS, the total quantity of output, i.e. real GDP, firms will produce and sell. AD curve, the total spending on domestic goods and services at each aggregate price level. AS curve, the total amount of output, i.e. real GDP, that firms will produce and sell at each aggregate price level. Foreign price effect. If prices rise in the United States while remaining fixed in other countries, then goods in the United States will be relatively more expensive to goods in the rest of the world. Interest rate effect. As the aggregate price level rises, the same purchases will take more money or credit to accomplish, driving up interest rates. Long run. Period of time which all wages and prices are fully flexible. Long run aggregate supply. Vertical line at potential GDP, showing no relationship between the aggregate price level and real GDP in the long run. Potential GDP, the maximum quantity that an economy can produce given full employment of its existing levels of labor, physical capital, technology, and institutions, also known as full employment GDP. Short run, period of time during which wages and some prices are sticky in response to a change in demand. Short run aggregate supply, positive short-run relationship between the aggregate price level and real GDP, holding the prices of inputs fixed. Wealth effect. As price level increases, the buying power of savings that people have stored up in bank accounts and other assets will diminish. The horizontal axis of the diagram shows real GDP, that is, the level of GDP adjusted for inflation. The vertical axis shows the aggregate price level. The slope of an AS curve changes from nearly flat at its far left to nearly vertical at its far right. As the quantity produced increases, however, certain firms and industries will start running into limits. In the long run, all wages and prices are fully flexible. As a consequence, all resources will be fully employed, and real GDP will equal potential regardless of the price level. In the long run, real GDP will be independent of the price level, and the long-run aggregate supply curve will be vertical at the potential or full employment output level. This can be seen on the graph as potential GDP, as in the figure, or as LRAS. The aggregate demand curve. Just like aggregate supply curve, the horizontal axis is real GDP, the vertical axis is price level. The aggregate demand curve is downward sloping from left to right, which means that a decrease in the price level leads to an increase in the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services. Even though the AD curve looks like a microeconomic demand curve, it doesn't operate the same way. Why is it downward sloping? The wealth effect. As the price level increases, the buying power of savings that people have saved up will diminish. It's eating away, to some extent, by inflation. Because a rise in price level reduces people's wealth, consumption spending will fall as price level rises. Interest rate effect. As prices for outputs rise, the same purchases will take more money or credit to accomplish. This additional demand for money or credit will push interest rates higher, which will reduce borrowing by businesses for investment purposes and reduce borrowing by households for homes and cars, thus reducing consumption and investment. Foreign price effect. If prices in the United States rise, while remaining fixed in other countries, then goods in the United States will be relatively more expensive compared to goods in the rest of the world. A higher domestic price level relative to price levels in all other countries will reduce net export expenditures. Interpreting the AD-AS model. Step 1, draw your X and Y axis. Label the X-axis real GDP and the Y-axis price level. Step 2, plot AD on your graph. Step 3, plot AS on your graph. Step 4, determine where AD and AS intersect. Step 5, look at the graph to determine where equilibrium is located. Step 6, determine what the steep portion of the AS curve indicates. Step 8, and I'm noticing there's a step 7 missing. I'll fix that. Step 8, draw conclusions from the information. If equilibrium occurs in the flat range of AS, then the economy is not close to potential GDP and will experience unemployment, but stable price levels. If equilibrium occurs in the steep range of AS, then the economy is close or at potential GDP and will be experiencing rising price levels or inflationary pressures, but will have a low unemployment rate. Examining the AS-AD model. Consider the schedule below. What's the equilibrium price and real GDP? So take a look and you can see that real GDP, quantity demanded per trillion, is equal to real GDP, quantity supplied per trillion at 13 trillion, and that it sets a price level of 100. So the answer should be B, 113. Shifts in aggregate demand. Demand shocks, events that shift the aggregate demand curve. Positive demand shock is a rightward shift in AD. Negative demand shock is a leftward shift in AD. Business confidence. If businesses feel more confident, ceteris paribus, then firms tend to spend more on investment, believing that the future payoff from that investment will be substantial. If business confidence drops, then investment spending declines. Consumer confidence. When consumers feel more confident about the future of the economy, ceteris paribus, they tend to increase spending. When they feel less confident, they tend to decrease spending. Shifts in aggregate supply. Negative supply shock, a leftward shift in SRAS and LRAS. Positive supply shock, a rightward shift in SRAS and LRAS. Stagflation, an economy experiences stagnant growth and high inflation at the same time. A supply shock in general is an event that shifts both short-run and long-run aggregate supply curves. When an economy's output increases and the price level increases, the blank has shifted to the blank. So in order for the economy to have output and price level increase, it must be that the AD curve is shifting to the right. Try working it out. How productivity growth shifts the AS curve. The most important factor shifting AS is productivity growth. Productivity means how much output can be produced with a quantity given of inputs. Productivity grows so that the same quantity of labor can produce more output. The real growth in GDP per capita in an advanced economy like the United States has averaged about 2 to 3% per year. Of course, it's lower now with the pandemic. Productivity growth has been faster during certain extended periods like the 1960s and the late 1990s through the early 2000s, or slower during periods like the 1970s. Business cycles and growth. Business cycles represent the slowing down, declining, and speeding up of the economy, or more formally, recessions and expansions. The ADAS model gives us one way to understand these cycles. Recession occurs as a result of a negative demand or supply shock, which causes the equilibrium level of real GDP to fall substantially below potential. So take a look. Here is a negative AD shock and a negative SRAS shock, and that's in both cases moving real GDP lower. Here we have the opposite, where we're showing that there is cyclical unemployment and that the AD curve is shifting to the right. The SRAS curve is shifting to the right. Cyclical unemployment increases when output falls substantially below GDP on the ADAS diagram, and it can increase or decrease depending on which way the shocks are. Inflationary pressures. The ADAS framework implies two ways that inflationary pressures may arise. If aggregate demand continues to shift to the right when the economy is already at or near potential GDP and full employment, thus pushing the macroeconomic equilibrium into the steep portion of the AS curve. So here you can see a rightward shift of AD is causing the price level to go up. Same thing here with the SRAS, it's shifting back into the right, which causes price level to go up. Quick review: describe the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, define and explain the aggregate supply curve and the economic behavior behind it, compare and contrast short-run and long-run aggregate supply curves, define and explain aggregate demand and behavior behind it. What is the difference between the two concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Identify the equilibrium level of real GDP and equilibrium price level using ADAS model. What conclusions can be made about the macroeconomy using this model? What are the causes and implications of shifts in aggregate demand? How does productivity growth and changes in input prices change aggregate supply curve? Use aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to explain recessions, expansions, and economic growth. Explain how unemployment and inflation can be explained using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and what is the importance of the AS-AD model. And that's all.